Welcome, everyone. Thank you much for joining us for an opportunity to once again spend time together with Sam Bach and Larry Langer. For me, it is an extraordinary privilege and pleasure simply to be in the presence of these two gentlemen sometimes. What a joy to have been the matchmaker many, many years ago after reading Larry's Art from the Ashes and looking for someone who would be interested in and willing to write about 20 large paintings that Sam had done called Landscapes of Jewish Experience. I reached out to Larry, and Larry said, well, I really tend to write about literature of the Holocaust, and really art is not my thing. I just recounted to Larry that as of this moment, he has written 150,000 words about the art of Samuel Bach. And if nothing else, it probably is an enormously wonderful body of work for anyone who wants to engage not only with Sam's art, but with the perspective that Larry brings to all of us as to how we continue to relate to, not understand for sure, the Holocaust in a very honest and clear way, rather than making it into some sentimental journey as time passes. I often say in the gallery when people visit that Americans are particularly interested in musical comedies and happy endings. In dealing with Sam's work, we have neither. We have honest visions of and testimonies about the major atrocity, certainly in my lifetime and in most of our lifetimes. And most appropriately, this exhibition is called Figuring Out. Certainly an ironic title, because none of us yet have been able to figure out much about the human condition and why people do what they do. Today, we're framing the conversation around works in this exhibition that Larry has specifically chosen to have his interpretation and Sam's response. But it also needs to be cognizant of the Ukraine, the bestiality and horror that goes on, as a reminder that Sam's life and experience is specific to a time, but that the human condition in its constant battle with and against evil doesn't seem to change. So without saying too much more, I'm just very grateful to both of them for being willing to spend time with us. And as Sam pointed out, it is recorded. So it will also serve as a reference document going forward, and something that we should have been doing all along over these past 54 years. So I'm grateful, Rose, for your help. And shall we look at the first image?
Any moment now. 1 second.
We not make this the first image?
Yeah, this one.
Oh, this is better.
That's much better. So this is not, it's close if the book of Genesis gives us any sense of beginnings. This seems to be a rather good topic to begin with. So Larry, if you want to begin, and then Sam, if you'll respond as well.
All right, I spent the last 2 days talking to these 5 paintings. And if you're patient and listen carefully, they begin to talk back to you. And I really mean that. I made, you know, it's more than 25 landscapes of Jewish experience. My first essay in Sam is now more than a quarter of a century ago. I can't believe that. And for the first few volumes, I said to myself, well, I can do a few, but after that, I won't find anything new to say. And the most remarkable thing, among the many remarkable things about Sam's painting, is that I always find something new to say, because he always finds something new to paint. And I was going to say he always finds something new to say. Artists don't talk, paintings don't talk, but Sam's paintings do talk if you listen to them. You know, I looked at this and I had a new revelation. he calls this figuring out. And I looked at it and I said, he has a habit of painting a background with a foreground so that the foreground blocks out part of the background and prevents us from appreciating the background as we might appreciate it if there were no foreground. And then I thought, this is a landscape painting. And then I thought, well, there's a tradition of landscape painting. The Hudson River School in America in the 19th century, and British and French landscape painting. And its purpose was to encourage us to appreciate the beauty of the landscape. And I looked at this painting and I said, if this foreground were not here, we would see water, we would see a stream, we would see sky, we would see some clouds, you might see some trees, and it's not there. What Sam has done is reconfigured the idea of landscape painting because modern history has interfered with the way in which we used to appreciate beauty, we can't do anymore. So this is a reconfigured landscape painting. Now, it's a new landscape for Adam and Eve. You look at Adam and Eve is not a woman anymore. Eve is now stone. Adam is still partly a human being. The series is called Figuring Out. And Sam, who is so fond of punning, and I'll say more about that later, you know, Eve has been figured out of this painting as a human being and now part of the stone. So one of the questions this painting asks us is, how do you refigure yourself back into the human being you were before the Adam and Eve story began? Adam is leaning, or the tree is leaning against him. Their problem began with a tree. They were forbidden to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but they did. Once they learned about the knowledge of good and evil, they left their world of innocence behind them. That doesn't mean that human life stopped. It just meant that the innocence of Eden was gone forever. Then they had a world of good and evil before them. And here they are looking at a landscape and asking them the question that they asked and we asked throughout history: how do we manage to endure? And one of the paintings we'll talk about later is called Enduring. How do we manage to endure in a world that was made perfect? It was made imperfect by the fact that human beings have to face a universe that includes good and evil. Now, if you look at the foreground, it's a disordered assembly of broken trees, sawed off, chopped up. There's, in the next painting we look at, we'll see at least some leaves growing. Here, there's almost nothing there. One of the things Sam is fond of doing, and I've never solved this, is to include rope in his paintings. As I said, he's fond of punning and maybe using rope to help us tie up the meaning of the painting, but his ropes don't do that. They confuse us as much as they offer us insight. But this new landscape for Adam and Eve is not only a new landscape for Adam and Eve, it's a new landscape for you and me. We are continually having to face a universe which in its background has the possibility of grandeur and beauty, and in its foreground has imagery of destruction. Now, the last thing I want to mention is this is not just humanity. We have on the left-hand side, Morgan Dovey, a Star of David, and on the right-hand side, a kind of fragment of Star of David. The fate of the Jewish people is involved in this painting too. One of the problems in for the modern imagination is how to face a future when behind us we have a background which includes the fate of the Jewish people during the Holocaust. I haven't answered any, but I've raised a number of questions, and now maybe Sam would like to say something about this.
Well, Larry, you speak so beautiful of my work that it is very difficult for me to follow up in your steps. Just a few thoughts. When I painted this painting with this kind of acidity of the color yellow, it is simply because yellow remains for me always the color of the, what you said in Yiddish, gele latte. It was the Star of David that we had to sew on ourselves. And the gele latte in Yiddish has nothing to do with cafe latte. A latte is a patch. A patch, it patches up things that are torn and so on. And I thought of the world in which we live. I thought of how things are always not secure, how certain events depend on other events. There is this pulling to the right and to the left, which these ropes for me represent. And mainly I thought of this thing of the tree of life that is scattered, that has been cut up. And I was thinking also, when I painted it, I just confessed to you some very private thoughts. I was also thinking of the families that are scattered. The family tree is scattered all over. My own family is today, my close family is in Switzerland, in France, in the United States, in South Africa, and so many families in the world, so many families are scattered on the globe. So somehow this kind of scattering, the pulling, the falling apart and so on of things that we knew, I mean, they all nourished me. I have nothing specific to say about these things, but I'm simply sharing with you some thoughts and ideas that went through me when I painted this painting.
For me, Sam, as ever, there is absolute beauty in the way that it is painted. And I always want to remind everyone who's listening and looking that first and foremost, you're a painter. And so the color, the texture in each of the pieces is so relevant to how one experiences it with or without the content. Larry does such an extraordinary job of identifying content well beyond, I think, your intention in many instances, but nonetheless enlightening to the extent that it probably prompts in you another 20 or 30 ideas. And as long as the frame shop is around, we're in good shape.
Yeah.
With the notion of the tree, and Larry, the ropes for me have always been not only hanging by a thread, which all our life is. So there's a tenuousness about everything. Sam did a painting many years ago called Forever. And in it was the spelled out word still life, with the word if emphasized in the middle of life. Everything was conditional, and the pile of the letters themselves was held by a single thread. And that always has been a reminder to me, especially with the ironic title, Forever. We're all here just for a brief time, and we're here, and our existence is very tenuous. So I think in addition, I would just mention here that one of the possible names for the Samuel Bach Museum that is to be built on the campus of the University of Nebraska in Omaha is the House of Questions. And together, you and Sam are the Question Brothers. So it is a pleasure, and I would encourage people to write down these questions, encourage them to try to engage with these questions, because the museum itself will be unique in that rather than providing answers, the goal of it is to incentivize individual human beings to come in and question why they're here and what they can do to somehow make a slight difference in the world we're living in. So we'll move to the second painting, Rose, if that's okay.
Okay, it's my turn again.
I think, yes, but I think maybe the next one, Larry will reverse the order and let Sam talk a bit about it and then have you respond to it. But
Fine.
this one, yes.
Well,
Oh,
if you wish, this is a kind of a self-portrait. So one of the very many self-portrait, disguised self-portraits that I painted in my paintings. And people ask me very often, so where are your roots? Since you have moved so much, born in Vilna, you lived in Italy, you lived in France, you lived in Switzerland, you lived in the United States, you lived in Israel. Where are your real roots? And I must confess, I have a feeling that the roots are with me, and I always carry with me something, some brushes in my hand that are, if you wish, a little twig with leaves that I can plant wherever I come. And it is not an easy burden. It is not an easy burden to reestablish myself in so many different places and so on. In the last, next year it will be 90 years. But I have done it, and I have this extraordinary privilege to turn my personal diary into art that speaks, that tries to speak of all of us, of the world in which we live. And it is so very fortunate to have people like the two of you, Bernie and Larry, who respond to it with so much sensitivity and feeling. What can I say? I'm really blessed.
you're up, Larry.
Well, I do not apologize for finding visual possibilities in Sam's paintings beyond his intention. That's true of all great art. And if you can't
Absolutely.
find that, that's a limitation of the art. I personally feel the last individual to ask about the meaning of a painting is the person who did the painting. Because that would limit us only to intentions. There are two arrows there, one pointing toward the future, one pointing in the direction that the figure is conveying his burden, and his burden is as important to me as the destination in which he's carrying his burden. And the arrow pointing toward the past, let's say, as the other one points toward the future, is bloodied in its tip. And what troubles me most is the superficial conclusion of some viewers of the painting that because he's carrying a branch with live leaves in the hand, that means that all he has to do is replant, that a new tree will grow and a new future uncluttered by the burden of the past will be possible. And it's clear to me from this painting, one of the things it's saying is that you take your burden with you, you don't leave it behind. And there is no certainty that whatever will grow from the roots that is taken with him will mean you can now leave behind the buried roots from the past, or they won't have to bother you anymore. That's not true. So that whatever future you're going towards will have to include and involve the past you're leaving behind. That's what this says to me.
There is Brother Thomas's quote that memory is more permanent than matter. And it seems to me that particularly with this painting and what you said, Larry, that none of us are freed of the memory. And certainly Western civilization needs to consistently acknowledge that part and parcel of what we are carrying with us is the disastrous First World War, Second World War, you can go back further, but the built-in inhumanity that exists within human beings. And unless and until we're prepared to acknowledge that, the likelihood of making significant change in how we behave The major significant change, in fact, has occurred because the weaponry is even greater. So the capacity not to have two kings or warriors fight and then settle between two nations, now you just simply destroy people with weapons, and they're impersonal to the extent that they're rockets. So you just aim them, or bombs that you drop above us. So there is, at least in the old duels, there were two people fighting it out. Now the truth is that there is this objectivization, cleaning up, if you will, of the need to see the blood. You just kill people. And that part, it seems to me, is ever present. What I'd like, Sam, for you to do is to respond slightly to the branch in your hand, because I have this great picture I took of you just the other day with your paintbrushes. And I love the picture. We were on the screen, and there you were, and there you were with your brushes, which are your leaves in a way. So I'm not sure, Larry, that it's trees that Sam's planting, but he certainly is planting questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Really, really quite
I
right.
think that this painting also speaks separately of its content, something about my recent works as compared to my much older things. I think that you can see, if you look at this painting, a much more vigorous brushwork, which is something that that actually absorbed me very much, because when I paint, the idea, the content, all these things, they float there, they're in my mind. But my major work is to establish a composition, is to control the shapes, is to see how the eye moves and in what directions the various brush strokes go, to the right, to the left, and so on. Because every part of a painted canvas has exactly the same responsibility. It takes on responsibility, it gives up responsibility, sometimes more dense, sometimes more airy, but I would say that 95% of my work is controlling the subject of form. And when we speak about my art, 90% or even sometimes 100% go only into the content of what the form contains. But it's okay. Maybe I think this is maybe how it should be.
I just want to go back to it, Rose, then in fairness to what Sam said, if you have 1 second, to point out, if nothing else, then as we look at the painting, the negative spaces, and beginning with the little space above the conveyor's head to the space defined by the branch and the coming down branch, the branch that are being carried, every element of the sense of distance is enhanced by the negative spaces. Look at the movement of the clouds above and the direction that they're forcing your eye to go in. So that what Sam's talking about and the shadows on the ground, all of these make it so that if you could somehow take the subject out of the painting and reduce it to a design or grid, you would then see, I think what Sam was talking about was that fundamental to his approach to every image that he creates is in fact the notion that it is a painting, that it is a work of art, and it is not only determined by its content. The final thing I'd mention is, and many of you know this, that the paintings as they exist are only titled by Sam when he's done. So that the title frequently for other artists would indicate a direction or a content-aware presentation. Sam is looking at this afterward and then naming it. So we too can participate, in a sense, recognizing what is before us, and then we can title them as well. So if we can go to the next one, and the reason I wanted to talk about this is the negative space isn't as great in this one. So I thought we might as well use that one as an example. So Larry, please, this is an extraordinary piece. Some of these paintings are in the present exhibition, and about 75 of them are in an exhibition that we will do in another 6 to 8 months, because I couldn't resist the fact that there are so many wonderful paintings, but we didn't want to overstuff the gallery.
Well, I had the same insight looking at this as I did looking at the landscape paintings to begin with. First of all, I looked at this, I said, this is monstrous. And then I looked at the face and the eyes, and I said, the face isn't monstrous. Something about this is monstrous. And then I said, well, as with the landscape paintings, this is part of a long tradition of art called portrait painting. This is a portrait of a human being, but a portrait unlike any we've ever seen before. If you think of the portrait of George Washington at the Museum of Fine Arts, you think of the self-portraits of Rembrandt, you think of the Mona Lisa. They're all faces of human beings. You don't look at them and say, that looks just like George Washington, that looks just like Rembrandt at a certain age. You try to find out where is the humanity in the face of these particular individuals. And it occurred to me that many of the paintings in the Figuring Out group ask a related question. Who am I? How do we establish identity for ourselves in a universe that assaults us in so many gruesome ways? The painting is called Verbal Repair. He can't talk with nails in his mouth. How can he describe the situation in which he finds himself? How can we describe the situation in which he finds himself? But while I'm looking at it, since Sam's mentioned it, and I should have mentioned it in looking at the previous landscape, because although that painting is a fixed object, it managed to capture an enormous horizontal movement. Everything seems to be moving in one direction or another, even though nothing is moving as we look at it. And here the nails force the eyes to look horizontally. His finger is pointing up. The edge of the hammer is pointing up. Hammers and nails are instruments of either can be instruments of destruction or instruments of repair. How do we balance one against the other? How do we, in a universe in which the human self is threatened, as he is threatened, by the nails and by the nail that obviously is not piercing his head, but piercing his hat, the colors seem to make him half metallic. His skin is clearly human. He's a human being of flesh, but he is surrounded by shades of gray and black, which make him something other than human.
I'm going to leave this, Sam, it's your.
I can, yes, I must say, I'm looking at it on the screen of my computer and I see it almost the size of the original. And I'm quite happy with how, in spite of the small size and so on, the energy of the brush work is showing itself. I mean, yes, I was speaking here about the human condition in which we must fight. We must fight to repair destruction. The fighter here has this hat, which is obviously made of metal, and it is fixed to his head by a nail that is not so easily removable because the hammer won't work. The hammer that is supposed to take out the nail. And this is something has to do again biographically in me, serving 3 years of my life in the Israeli army. I mean, 3 years that I feel were somehow stolen from me. And I think it is a condition of so many people on our planet that must fight wars. Look at the huge number of Russian killed in the Russian army, how many of them are recruits that have been forced into the army. So, I mean, this is one thing of the condition. And then, of course, there is this big nail that can repair something, but the nail is broken. The nail is kind of tied up, and I did not put it perchance very close to the mouth of this man, because words can carry in them a lot of repair. I think, Larry, one of the most extraordinary things that you achieve in your writing is a certain repair that your words bring to so many misconceptions that people have about the horrendous experience of the Holocaust. So these are just a few thoughts that that I can add to the vision of this painting.
Rose, I just had one question. There's a series of 8 hats called the Octet. I don't know if you can find them. They're in the book, so they may not be easily available. But as a brief commercial announcement, we are having those 8 paintings framed. And I saw them over a period of time when I was writing brief little comments about a block a day, and realized that we need to have those paintings in the gallery. So as of this evening or tomorrow, those 8 paintings will be hanging in the gallery. And I was reminded particularly of the hat in this particular painting and what hats do to people in terms of both creating their identity or hiding their identity, part of a disguise, not part of a disguise. And I very much like your comparison, Larry, to the whole tradition of portrait painting. When these hat wearers are Sam's portraits, the only artist that came to mind was Messerschmitt, who did these extraordinary sculptures of heads. And so Rose is showing them individually on the screen now. So just sort of ease your way through it. I don't know that they need commentary, but as an aperitif, I invite you to come and see these. They're just amazing. A brief story, when I was growing up, my Uncle Phil was an extraordinary raconteur. People adored him, but I didn't understand how he made a living. And I was told that he cleaned and blocked hats. Only later did I find out, in addition, he made book as well. He was a bookie. So there's a combination of hats that bring back those wonderful memories of Uncle Phil and the hats. But Sam has used these 8 hats, if nothing else, as you did, Sam, in the 8 contemporary allegories of the pairs. And that goes back to 1966, 1967. That you've said so many times to me that an artist has 1 or 2 good ideas. So at least you like the number 8. But I invite everyone to come and see those. They'll be up. They were just too good not to show, I guess, is where we're at with
Thank
them.
you. Thank you for showing them.
And on to the next one.
Yeah, okay. Good. This is one of the most, first of all, I should point out, this is not oil on canvas. This is charcoal and alkyd on brown paper. And so the texture is different. All kinds of things are different. Sam will understand this and explain it better than I can. This is one of the most frightening paintings, I think, that I've ever seen among Sam's works. It confirms what I suggested before. Who we are and who we become is in part, maybe in large part, shaped by the context within which we grow up, the kind of society in which we grow up. The people who have fled Ukraine are going to be changed by the experience that they are going through right now. And when they go back, if they don't go back, like Sam, there will be people who have pulled up roots, have gone somewhere else, will change their lives completely. I look at this and I don't see a human face. In fact, this is more mask than face, to tell you the truth. And it looks like a tree is growing up from between the front and the back of the shape of the head. And you wonder if there's a brain in there at all. Who am I? There's a question mark instead of an ear. How do I form an identity? And especially, and the painting, it's called Looking Forward. One of the aspects of Sam's work, it seems to me, that still needs to be explored in detail is his use of irony in his paintings. It's called Looking Forward, but we don't know what he's looking at. We don't know what he sees. For me, this is mechanized man in the 21st century, or a portrait. This is a different kind of portrait. Can't imagine Rembrandt ever painting a portrait like this, but I can imagine someone who lives in the technologized environment that we living in could paint a portrait like this. What does he see? Instead of eyes, he has, they look like Canon, but they're not. They might be magnifying instruments, but it's a mechanical facade. I was thinking when I looked at that, you know, how much of technology is shaping our life, you know, today. It sounds humorous, but I can foresee the time when we will be able to say, when I sit down for breakfast, Alexa, would you make me some scrambled eggs? And a robot will go over to the kitchen, scramble the eggs out, and bring them over to the table. More and more, we are depending on technology to shape who we are and not protesting against it. And this grim portrait of an excuse for a human being's face, looking forward and frightening us and being frightened itself by what it sees, suggests that moving forward in the middle of the 21st century may not be a happy way in which to proceed.
Well, if I can add something of my own thoughts to this, first of all, it's extraordinary that the technology allows us today to communicate. We are in different places, to see the painting on the screen, and to see it also on my screen bigger than it is in reality. And I had a lot of nachas, I must say, of myself when I looked at this small painting and the vigorous brushwork that is used in it, which I would not dare to make on a large painting. But the whole idea here was to introduce the human presence in a landscape, a presence which is certainly not as steadfast as the trees that grow, that one day can be there, another they can be expulsed and sent away. If you look at the eyes, one of them has something of a ring. The other one can also be a gun. It is obviously not a human being that you see. It is a kind of a symbol of the human presence. It is a mask. It is most probably much, much bigger than a real human face. And what is there to look forward to? We don't know. We don't know. And as far as what Larry mentioned before, the irony, oh yes, there is a lot of irony in my work. But irony is a wonderful thing that allows you to have a better perspective of things. Sometimes the way it is used by Kafka, or the way it is used by Thomas Mann. But irony, again, I must say, I just read a few days ago about the book, The Magic Mountain of Thomas Mann. And the author that wrote about this book said, what a pity that today we read this book as a kind of nostalgic evocation of a time that has gone by, but we're unable to seize anymore that very deep irony that is at the basis of the book that is willed by Thomas Mann, because simply the times have changed our terms of reference. So, well, there are a few thoughts about this painting. Sorry, Larry, to have entered your literary domain.
It's good you both are there. Sam, would you talk technically about how this is done in terms of the surface of the piece that you were responding to?
How it is painted?
Yeah.
Oh, it's just, it is what we call drawings, and there are many drawings. They are all done in various techniques. This one is done on a brown paper that I have covered with a specific varnish so that it accepts well what you call the alkyd. Alkyd today is very similar to oil paint. It simply dries faster, but it has the viscosity and it has this kind of supple character where you can leave the visible brush stroke alive, and yet the brush stroke represents something. It represents leaves, it represents greenery, it represents a tree, or maybe a metal of which the face is made. And of course, where the questioning is represented by the question mark that comes here instead of the year. I mean, whatever we hear, we wonder, is it true? Is it false? We live in a country that has become really specialized in well, I don't want to say stolen elections with all that it means, but in belief in things which are not true, alas.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, because this also reads as if it is gouache. There's an opacity to the surface in many areas that creates a richness of a surface. Yeah. And yet, and I think it's important for others to know that most of the oil paintings are done first, and then these works on paper are done afterwards. So the ideas are, in a sense, worked through and familiar. And then when the pieces of paper show up, there's a kind of pouring out of ideas and further questions that happens in your own process that makes many of the drawings feel extraordinarily spontaneous and without losing any of the questions that Larry is interested in. Next image, Rose.
Very right.
Oh.
So this we added both to our discussion today, but also to our exhibit. Figuring out for me when Sam began sharing these works was an important added step along the way by making figures important. In the past, whether it was pears, dice, candles, clocks, birds, there's a list, a shopping list of Samuel Bach that one can look under in the catalog raisonné, certainly pears, which he just researched, and apparently there are now 1,682 pears in the world so far, which is every indication that there'll be more. But the idea of figures making up an entire show, not specific to Adam and Eve, not specific to the book of Genesis or the Sistine Chapel, was very powerful. And the metaphor allows a distance where there's chess, it's over here and we're over here. The questions are still being asked, or the cup and saucer. There's a distance. There are stories in your personal life that brought you to those subjects. The figures, there's less room to not confront the figures. And so, Sam, if you talk a bit about figuren and figures, and that's the background of why it's now in the show.
Well, I must say that when I studied art, it was very strange because in the academy, we still had to work on live models and controlling the rendering of a human figure, of a portrait or a figure, male, female, and so on, was somehow the basis of learning how to draw, how to paint. At the same time, what was going on in the world of art was going in a direction of total abstraction, and painting figures was almost a taboo. If you wanted to be a young painter who somehow belongs to the scene of what is happening and what is important, you have to give up dealing with figures. Figurative art, I'm speaking of something 60, 70 years ago, seemed to be condemned, taboo. And yet I was somehow in myself torn by the fact that when I was going to museums, when I was touched by art produced in centuries before, these were all figures that spoke to me. And the figuring out of this specific painting is a kind of a composite of the angel that I took from Dürer and put him there with a head which is almost a self-portrait of looking at so many cutouts of the boy of Warsaw, put one over the other. And the frightening things about all these, you have a feeling here that there are hundreds maybe of these cutouts, one on top of the other, comes to me from a very, very grim story that I heard from one of the survivors of Ponari, who were the slave laborers that were ordered by the Nazis to dig up the bodies of Ponari and burn them. And that was when the Russians were getting closer to Vilnius, and the Nazis wanted simply to hide the traces of their crimes. And it was one of the most horrible human experiences that one can imagine. There were people that were digging in the graves of thousands, many thousands of dead bodies, some of them discovering people they knew, some of them even members of their family and their own children. It was absolutely horrendous. And the Nazis called these dead bodies, they called them figures. They called them Figuren. So the Figuren and the figures and the figuring out how is it that we got there? How was it possible? All these questions remain suspended in the air for me when I look at this painting.
Hence, Larry, would you like to comment on the painting? It wasn't part of our designated images.
Yes, something that wasn't mentioned. The only vitality, human vitality in the painting is the image of the angel. The boy from the Warsaw Ghetto, as Sam mentioned, is just a wooden cutout. But, you know, to defend the need to also discuss the meaning implications of these paintings, I look at the head. First of all, it's remarkable that the head of the angel must be a ½ inch by a ½ inch, if that, and yet Sam has managed to achieve a human face. I always wonder at how he manages to do that. What is the angel thinking about? How do you link the holiness of the angel to the dehumanized fate of the boy in the Warsaw Ghetto? An angel is a messenger between God and the man. He's holding in his book, Holy Scriptures. We don't know, but he's holding a book in his hand and wondering, what am I doing here? And what is sacred about what I'm looking at? Because this was once a boy. And there were many boys like that. 1.5 million children were killed in the Holocaust. And as you mentioned, we need a museum about questions. because the painting doesn't offer any answers. It just raises issues that one has to meditate on, and very important issues, not trivial issues, very crucial issues in the spiritual history of mankind. As he sits there and meditates, as the rest of us are invited to do too, how do we handle the fate of this boy and the other boys? And how does it fit into a universe of meaning if we do in fact inhabit a universe of meaning?
Thank you for the last question. I'm not always sure that the answer is yes to that we inhabit a universe of meaning. Rose, I think there's one more, if I'm not correct. So let's.
I have a small thought.
Yes,
They're
please.
tiny. But looking at this, for some reason, again, you pointed this out before, but it's nice to be able to solely focus on one piece for an extended period of time. And I think something just interesting is this is one of the few angels in Sam's work that doesn't have wings that are made out of very heavy material. So this looks like almost a believable angel. You know, they maybe are strapped onto his back, but you know, they're not made of scrap metal or wood or nails, or kind of have this illusion of the angel being more of a prisoner to the weight on his back, which I think is interesting. And then also I thought of this when Larry said, what is sacred? And in this scene, it sort of makes me think of a bedtime scene of like a father and child being read a book of stories, and you've got this outline of these, you know, the Warsaw boy, the ghetto boy, and stacking. So you sort of have this thought of children and this sort of sacred moment between parent and child of sort of story time and nighttime that's sort of been robbed from them. And maybe it's because my own father is bald and sort of looks similar and would read me stories that I sort of thought about that, but that was sort of a scene that I'm thinking of now.
I'm very grateful.
Thank you, Rose, for mentioning that. You know, it reminded me of the stories I was reading to my children, to my daughters, in order to make them sleep. And you certainly touched here something very, very emotional in this idea of a parent reading to a child something. And in some way, these 1.5 million children that were put to eternal sleep, they needed some kind of memorial of some kind. And there is this angel that I don't know if it is a very believable angel, because angels are not supposed to have a sexual denomination. I mean, they are something between male and female. Even the famous Melancholia of Dürer, we do not know if it is a male or it is a female. Because this is the nature of angels in a certain culture, in a certain vision. But
The
here
reality-
it is a bearded angel. So the bearded angel is more like me. When I don't think that my wife told me very often that I'm an angel, but
but your parents did, I'm sure.
yeah, my parents.
The number one only child.
Well, maybe I feel myself that I'm an angel.
But I think the other issue is that so far, as far as I know, none of us have really seen angels. And so you're free to have your angel, Rose, be it your father reading your stories. But I think going back to Larry's point, sadly, the story that is here, or what prompted this, is the tragic behavior of human beings. And how do we account for that? And how do we deal with that? How do we think about it? And how do we figure it out? I think there's one more image, right? Let's look at that and see if we can figure it out from this. I love it. So Larry, you've chosen it, and I love Hocus Pocus anyway.
This may be my favorite painting in the entire series. I've been trying to figure out why. That man's face is 1 inch by 2 inches. And yet it's as detailed a portrait as any I've ever seen Sam do. And I just marvel at your ability to do that. As I do, it's too late now, but as you were talking about the last painting with the angel, I was marveling at the technique of creating a vast landscape of trees and grass and stones going back and back into the distance with no apparent effort on display. There's a mastery of technique, which is just amazing to me. But here, you see, I guess you take away what you need to take away. People will look at HOPE and see, there's hope for everyone. And I say to myself, hope is 4 letters in the English alphabet. That's all it is. Hope doesn't mean that there is hope. It's just 4 letters that say there is hope. First of all, I look at the background and say, is it important or isn't it? What I see in those letters is not HOPE, but us. And I try to relate the us to the expression on the face of this man. He sees something. His mouth is slightly open. His eyes are staring, not in dismay and not with pain. And I have no idea what he's looking at. And there may be nothing there but just cloth, but he has realized something. First of all, he's managed to break that nail and it's not penetrating him in any way, as in the earlier portrait. He's free of it. Another thing, which I'll never understand your fascination with rope, Sam, but it turns up again and again. In earlier paintings, it was related to the Akedah and the binding of Isaac, but you drifted away from that. And the eye is drawn upward by this red rope, and it's drawn horizontally with a little tilt upward by the blue rope. And one of the things I love about many of your paintings is that they don't end in the painting. They go on beyond the frame of the painting. This is a taut rope, that red rope, which means it's either attached to something or someone is holding it. What's it attached to and why? Or who is holding it and why? And the same for the blue one. It's not, unless you're violating, as you do sometimes, violating the laws of physics, it's just floating in air. But here it's not. Here it goes off somewhere. The hammer is here under some control. It's being bound by the rope. And for the first time in the paintings we've just looked at, the human figure seems to be in control of something. And we're not sure what. A recognition or a realization that identity involves more than just me, but involves us. And how do we create a world, and boy, is this a relevant question, in which we think of us instead of just me. The rest is hocus pocus, and maybe hope is hocus pocus. You can pull out of this a message of hope, or you can pull out of this a message that says, let's stop talking about hope and try to understand instead what he's looking at and what he's realized, which has awakened him to the need for something that we have to translate into language. Now, Sam's paintings all have titles, and I'm sure he spends a lot of time figuring out an appropriate title. He's not thinking of hope. He's recognized, it seems to me, he's recognized that the way to exist in our worlds is to find a way of enduring what Adam and Eve had to endure when they realized that they were entering a world full of good and evil. What Bernie earlier remarked about the knowledge that in some people there's an inhumanity that we have to learn to deal with, we have to learn to endure. Survival doesn't mean substituting hope for despair. Survival means finding a way of balancing the one and the other so that we can go on with our existence in spite of the fact that we live in a world which will always involve some kind of tension between hope and despair. The question, and this is going to be wonderful for students, you say he's seen something, what do you think he sees? And what's the is an epiphany, a revelation, an inspiration, a realization, all kinds of words you can use for that. But it demands us to respond to it and not just look at it and say, well, okay. He looks a little excited, maybe a little puzzled. There's no specific meaning or answer to this. There are possibilities and a little ambiguity. And I said this before, this is true of all great art. They introduce possibilities into a way of thinking about the world in which we live. And this painting certainly does that for me.
Sam, please.
Thank you very much, Larry. I do not think that I can add anything substantial to what you have said so rightly and so beautifully about this painting. It is definitely an enigmatic painting. I do not think that it has only one specific meaning. I think it has layers of meanings, as you have mentioned, Larry. And I think that what people see, what they get from a work of art has a lot to do with what they bring to the work of art with their own personality. And they try to look, describe it to themselves, find the words that they have, and then it becomes theirs. So I can only express my gratitude, Larry, for all the incredible insights and understanding that you have brought to my art, and understanding in a sense of your participation in helping other people to understand what I'm trying to achieve.
I would add, Sam, that he's also helped you understand what you've done and incentivized you to make many, many, many more paintings. So Larry, you're to blame for the number of works and the energy that Sam has brought to it. I just want to end by remembering the time that the two of you were sitting in the gallery and Larry was being honored and Sam said, well, if I was not an atheist, but a God-fearing one, I would think that God made Larry my brother. And I think that the two of you together are the best of brothers, that you have really energized and incentivized one another to continue to confront us with the permanent questions of our humanity and how we can just live in this world that is so difficult and sad and demanding. And both of you together are just amazing figures in our lives and an enormous opportunity to just be together with almost 180 years of wisdom. So thank you both. Thank everyone for helping us try to figure out. Rose, thank you for your contribution, and hope that everyone will continue to explore these issues for themselves and make some slight commitment to making this a better place to live. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.